Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. There's something hunting U.S. Marines in the desert of California. I want to remain anonymous due to the nature of the story. See, I was in the Marine Corps. No, I wasn't in any special forces or anything unique per se. I was just a regular rank-and-file Marine. I was stationed at 29 Palms Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Training Center, CACT for short. I wasn't the only one who has seen or experienced things in the training grounds and surrounding areas. I was told to keep my mouth shut, but I'm gonna die soon anyway, so even if they do come for me, it isn't going to make a difference. It was during early April, so the weather wasn't too bad. It wasn't hot during the day, and it wasn't cold at night. I always enjoyed doing field ops during that time of the year. I got away from the dumb shit that we had to do day in and day out back on main side, and I was typically left to my own devices while out in the field. So late one night, me and a buddy of mine are doing fire watch for our section of the rest area. We had our rifles, plate carriers, helmets with our NVGs, night vision goggles, mounted on the front, and rifles with us. We also had 4 mags apiece of live ammo. That night an artillery battalion was doing night practice, so you'd hear the echo of the guns followed by the sound of the shells hitting the ground and exploding. It just sounded like far-off thunder. Me and my friend were talking about just random crap when I flipped down my NVGs and saw movement out in the distance. At first, I thought it was just the green tint of the goggles fucking with my head, but then I saw it again. I tapped my buddy and asked if he was seeing this. He flipped down his NVGs too, and he nodded. Yeah, but what is it? Coyote? He asked. No. Too big to be a coyote. Besides, it looks like it's running around on 2 legs. I said back to him. That's when he tapped me and pointed out into the dark. There's more than one, bro. He said. I looked to where he was pointing, and that's when I saw 4 or 5 other figures darting around in the dark. These things weren't that big. I'd say maybe about 5 feet 5 inches give or take. They also appeared to be very strong and built with massive arm and leg muscles. They were dark and their skin looked leathery. They had big dark eyes and no nose to speak of. Their mouth was wide and filled with razor-sharp teeth. They walked around hunched over with their arms dangling by their sides. Their arms themselves were massive. They ran at insane speeds, occasionally running on all 4. They had 4 fingers on each hand, and the claws were long and sharp. It was like they had daggers on there for nails. Dude, I think they're getting closer. I nodded. Yeah. I'm gonna go get the corporal up. He nodded, and I raced over to where our corporal was sleeping and shook him awake. Hey man, there's something out there. You need to come take a look. He cursed under his breath and sat up. This better be good, he said as he sat up. That's when we heard gunfire. I raced back to my buddy who was frantically shooting into the dark. I looked and I saw these creatures out in the dark, maybe 400 to 300 yards away. As other Marines had woken up to the sound of my buddy shooting, the OIC officer in charge came running up asking what the fuck was going on. When we pointed to the creatures, he froze in place. About this time, we heard tons of gunfire suddenly erupt from another unit who was conducting training as well. When I looked back at where these things were, they were no longer there. Instead, they were running on all 4s directly at us. I raised my rifle and began to fire at them as those with guns and ammo joined in and the others who didn't ran back to get theirs. I lined up my sights with the closest one and began to fire into it. I saw chunks of its flesh get ripped off when I hit it and it tumbled down, but without missing a beat it regained its balance and kept sprinting at us. At that point, I knew our rifles were useless, but I wasn't going to leave my buddy. That's when I heard the OIC yelling for us to get back in the trucks and get the fuck out of there and get back to main side. Me and my friend turned and booked it for our 7-ton. I flipped on the battery switch and my buddy cranked the truck on. As we began to start moving, I looked out the window in time to see these things reach the camp. A Marine who hadn't realized what was going on until it was too late was impaled by one of the creature's claws and fell to the ground. I watched as he tried to crawl away, but the thing leaned over a bit his upper torso and head completely off with a single bite. As we began to turn out of there, I saw a Humvee that had 3 of these things on racing towards it. The guy in the turret tried to flip the .50 cal around to unload into the creatures, but he wasn't fast enough, and one of them ripped him out of the turret and flung him to one of the others. He didn't have time to move before the thing sank its claws into his chest and began to eat him. I watched as the thing on top of the Humvee then jumped down onto the hood and shattered the bullet-resistant front glass and pull out the mangled corpse of the driver and run off into the desert with him. The remaining 3 Marines got out and made a run for our truck. I tapped my buddy to let them get on. They never made it. One by one the things picked them off and ran off with them, their screams fading off into the desert. By the time we got back onto the main road back to Mainside and caught up with the rest of our unit, we noticed how active the night sky had become. There were helicopters everywhere with searchlights. We figured someone had called it in, and they were trying to find the creatures or the missing Marines. Well, what was left of them anyways? When we were next up at the checkpoint, I noticed something off about the guys manning it. They wore all black, with black ski masks over their face and their MGs down. They didn't have any patches, name tapes, or no identification with them. They were armed to the teeth though. One of their vehicles had a minigun mounted on it. They all carried high-powered rifles with high-tech sights, laser sights, and other attachments on their rifles. When it was our turn, they had us step out of the truck and tell them what we saw. After we explained everything, the guy in charge looked at my friend and listed off his full name, date of birth, social security number, where his mom and dad were, the name of his dog that he had when he was in middle school. He then looked at me and did the same thing. Once he was done, he looked at both of us. If you mutter a word of what actually happened here tonight, you and your families will disappear for good. Do you understand? We both nodded with our jaws on the floor. The guy had mentioned things that I had never told anyone about. They then told us that if anyone asks, a group of Marines went off to go get something and wound up getting lost. With that, they sent us on back to the main side of the base. I got out about a year after that, but I never went on another field op again. To this day, I still relive that night when I go to bed each night. I just hope that whoever they were, they killed those things so no more Marines have to go out like that. In short, if you're ever stationed in 29 Palms, CA, and you go on a field op, keep an eye out in the dark and be sure you aren't too far away from a vehicle and pray those things don't decide to turn you into a meal. Second story. My neighbor Wendigo. You never really believe in something until you see it, and when you do, you'd wish that you hadn't. Sometimes not knowing is better. The things this world holds, the monsters that hide in the dark. I am forever haunted. I never had a problem being in the woods. I pretty much lived in them as a child. Climbing trees and swimming in random creeks were what I thrived on. Catching tadpoles, frogs, snakes, and any wildlife possible, I loved it. My fiancé and I moved to a tiny mountain town in North Carolina with his parents. They lived at almost the very top of mountain. If it snowed and you don't plow the driveway, it will ice and you will be stuck. For the most part, things were normal, well, as normal as they can be with a witch for a boyfriend. Ghosts and the random demon or dark entity were pretty common in our house, still are. So as I'm standing outside on the porch smoking a cigarette, I'm not too alarmed to feel a weird presence. As it stands, the backyard sits right on the edge of forest. So we spent much of our free time tracking animals and carcasses and ingredients. We both enjoyed the nature and recharge being there. Late at night, you have to stay vigilant for the various mountain critters that will attack. Cougars, bears, and coyotes the main threat. I stood on the porch, glancing around in the trees, keeping my eyes peeled for the first sign of danger. First, I hear the whispers like someone trying to get my attention. For the most part, won't ignore it. Then I hear a tree branch rustle. I rationalize okay, at about 10 feet off the ground it's either a bird, raccoon, or the like. How very wrong I was. The longer I stare, the more obvious the shape becomes. I can see these giant antlers at least 10 points. And face, oh God, that face. An elongated snout like a deer, only rotted to the bone with these patches of still rotting flesh. Empty sockets for eyes that stared into your soul and chilled you to the bone. Nothing good seen with those eyes. The head sat on an also still rotting torso, with broken ribs jutting out in every direction, giving the thought to a stabbing victim. Its organs that looked ready to spill out. And the stench, that unbearable stench of death and madness. I was stuck, frozen with terror. I shook and only watched this thing as it watched me. It only took me seconds to realize that the whispering was this thing trying to speak to me, coerce me to come to it. It asked me to walk towards it, let it devour me. It walked towards me on shaky, weak-looking deer legs, all 4 feet moving careful and without sound. Before I was able to blink, it has an arm stretched out. In front of me, long, jagged claws for tearing flesh. Sinewy muscles contracting under rotten meat. It is 20 feet away from me, but it seems like those fingers are centimeters away from me. I can feel the wind move. It brushed my cheek. This startled me into backing up into the door, only to have the porch light cut off and the door locked. All I can do is scream. I call for my fiancé, but I can hear him laughing behind the door, not knowing what was going on, trying to scare me. I tell him there's something out here trying to get me, the fear genuine. He swings open the door to yank me behind him while he looks around. There's nothing there. The thing vanished. He asked me what I saw, and all I could muster was Wendigo. I thought he'd given himself whiplash with how fast he spun around. He knows the word and the creature well. Native American folklore advises that you stay away from them, never speak to them, and most important, never turn your back. I've only recently told him the details of what I saw. The thing that haunts my nightmares and made me so afraid of the dark I can't be alone. I have never felt terror so heart-wrenching and chilling before. I felt a piece of me died and sucked into that monster's endless abyss for eyes. I never want to see that awful face again. I only thought that here was an appropriate place to share my story. Third story. My first and only hunting trip with my grandfather. My grandfather died a few months ago, and I felt that, in order to properly honor his memory, I needed to share this tale. I have a lot of stories about him, but I felt this was the one that was most important. He made me the man I am today. When I was growing up, I would spend summers at my grandparents' home in northern Washington. Their home was surrounded by a forest with nothing but a small dirt trail leading in and out. They lived around 5 hours outside any town, so we mostly had fish, game, and whatever they were growing that season. The majority of the time I spent there was spent fishing, gardening, or listening to my grandfather's tales from when he was a young man in Ireland. On my 14th birthday, he took me hunting for the first time. I gathered our bags and hunting bows and met him out front. He took his gear and handed me a small sprig from the blackthorn tree out back. Back in Ireland, he would keep them on him as a way to ward away evil spirits and take some with him every time he leaves the house. I figured it was just something he did as a sort of good luck charm, like a rabbit's foot. I tucked it into my back pocket and we set out on his normal hunting trail. It was nearly night before we set up camp. He was an old-fashioned camper, no tent or sleeping bag for him. He would only ever bring a blanket, pillow, and a fire steel. Once everything was set up, not that it took very long, he started telling another story from Ireland. A few hours and a meal of jerky and bread later, we went to sleep. I woke up a few hours before sunrise. The forest was never particularly loud, especially compared to our home in Seattle, but that night it was as if someone had muted everything. The fire had burned down to ash, and the night was lit by nothing but a small crescent moon, just enough to see it by. A dark figure stood just beyond the tree line, staring into the camp at me. I had never felt as terrified as I was that night. I had no idea what it was. It looked too tall for a human, and it made no sound as it started towards me, inching its way through the brush. I was frozen, too scared to move or even blink. I could just barely see the moon's glint in its eyes as it crossed the boundary into our makeshift camp. They were deep and dark, a terrible hunger in them. The closer it got to me, the more of it I could make out. Its body was tall, but emaciated. Arms too long for its body, pulled close to its chest tipped with several inch-long claws. It swayed and stumbled as it walked, never quite getting close enough to fall. It stopped a few feet from me, the hideous globes of its eyes never moving from mine. Just as it raised its arms and lunged for me, the sharp sound of an arrow zipping by broke the silence. It pierced into the beast's throat, covering the ground and its onyx flesh with blood. Its horrible scream rang through the night, breaking the hold my fear held on me, and I scrambled away from it. I hit something warm and solid behind me, but before I could even register that I'd stopped, a familiar hand on my shoulder threw me to the side, and my grandfather rushed the beast, a bright white blade in his hand. The beast burned as his blade cut into it, the smell of burning flesh adding to the metal scent in the air. All in all, it had only lasted a minute or so between when I first saw it and when it lay on the ground, an unmoving mass of flesh and mottled, black fur. My grandfather said it would be too dangerous to leave before then, but even more so to stay another night. We packed our bags up again, ate a small meal, and waited for daybreak. We headed back as soon as the sun came up. Before we left, I noticed something odd. My grandfather's sprig of blackthorn was tied around the arrow in the beast's throat. That was the last time we visited them for years. Fourth story. The Wendigo. I'm writing this from a small motel just outside Green Bay. Something has been stalking, or more accurately hunting me. I don't know what to do, and that's why I'm asking you to help. You all know the legend of the Wendigo, right? Maybe you know it by Wendigo. Algonquian legends describe this entity as a man-devouring beast native to the Atlantic coast and Great Lakes region, as well as parts of Canada. I think this is what's stalking me. It started happening when I moved into my summer cabin past Green Bay. Little things happened at first. My dogs would bark into the woods, but I would see nothing. I didn't think much of it, just that it could be a deer or mountain lion. That didn't worry me because I'm a native U.P. of Michigan native and have had previous hunting experience. Mostly this would happen and my dogs would growl into the woods, but then seemingly forget about to go romp around the cabin. Then came the night. As I lay in bed one night, I heard shuffling outside my window. My curtains were closed, but the window itself was open. My breathing hitched as I saw a shadow standing outside my window. Just know that the cabin doesn't have a high ceiling, so the windows are low, so I'm not sure the exact size of this creature. I lay frozen as bed as the shadow stayed there for what seemed like centuries, but could only have been a few minutes. Soon, the creature the shadow belonged to shuffled away, but not without emitting a guttural growl. This happened every night for the next 3 days. It would appear, stay, and then leave. After the third night of this, I woke up and went to check on my 2 hounds, Eleanor and Chip. I walked around to the back of the cabin where they slept curled up in their makeshift dog houses. I froze and felt my stomach rise up to my throat when I reached their spot. Blood was spattered everywhere, and body parts lay strewn all over the yard. Eleanor's figure lay disfigured and torn apart next to Chip's quivering body. He, thankfully, was unharmed, but shocked and in quite a mental state. What monster would do this? I thought despairingly. No bear or mountain lion would dismember a dog like this. I knew what had done this. The creature that stood outside my window every night. The strangest thing, however, wasn't the spattered blood and gore, but the pearly white flap of skin next to my dog's corpse. Good old girl didn't go down without a fight. I picked it up and turned it around in my hands. One side was an almost translucent pearly skin, and on the other a light bluish blood, I think. I dropped it immediately and ran back inside. I grabbed my old hunting rifle and my pack, which contained some food, water, and other camping necessities. The nearest highway was due north, but 38 miles, but I wanted out of these woods before nightfall. That's when it comes, during night. In the daytime, it stays in the woods always watching. always following. I let Chip loose, and we set a due east, where I knew a small town was less than 25 miles away. I could make it, but I would have to haul ass if I didn't want to die. Me and Chip walked for the first half of our journey, and then we ran. We made it to the town right before sunset, if you can even call it a town. There's a gas station, a motel, and a couple summer cabins by the lake. As we emerged from the woods, I heard the scariest sound of my life. The roar was deafening and pissed off. I knew that this wasn't the end of the game this son of a bitch was playing, but for me, tonight was enough. I am now staying at the motel, where the only residents are the owner, a runaway teen, and me. As far as I know, we could be the only people in this residence. I'm scared, so scared. I can feel it watching me, waiting, hunting. If I can survive another day, I will check in. But for now, I cannot fall asleep. The deadbolts on my door will not protect me, and Chip has started to growl at the door. I have survived yet another night from this beast that roams the woods of the Great Lakes. Thank you so much for your support and input. I know many of you have been wondering why I didn't drive out of there like I had the hounds of hell on my trail. One very important detail that I forgot to mention was that I had my friend dropped me off. I wanted to have a more authentic rustic experience and to get away from the city. My friend, let's call him Mark, was supposed to drive up every 2 days to check on me since he has a camp not too far away. Only he never showed. He dropped me off and then he vanished. I knew something must have happened to him because he was the type of guy you could rely on, and I had known him since first grade and he never flaked. Even though his cabin wasn't too far away, I decided not to risk it. I knew something must have happened to him and his wife. As soon as I get some answers from this godforsaken town, I'm going back to look for him. He would have done the same for me. I tried calling him from the phone in the office of the motel I'm staying at. No answer. Back on topic, all through the night I heard growling. At times it would sound distant, and at others close. I woke up to find long scratches on my motel door. I wonder why it didn't just tear it down and come get me. But it wants to play. I think it's because I might have woken it up. I don't know how or when, just that it's awake and coming after me. This morning, the creature left me a surprise. Eleanor's collar. It's a simple band of leather with her name inscribed on it. That fucker is going to pay. I have to get rid of it, even I don't survive. First it took my dog, and then my best friend, but no more. I woke up and walked around town for a bit, my rifle on my back and Chip by my side for protection. It turns out this town used to be larger, but when the stock market crashed, almost everybody left and never came back. Or so the motel owner tells me. He seems strange, though. He's skittish and is always looking off into the woods. The lights outside the motel are always on, and he keeps the doors to all the rooms locked. He's either hiding something or knows what's following me. I think it's both. I know this might sound stupid, but I might try to break into his office. There's something in there that can help me. I know it. Maybe I won't, though. I have the feeling that he could be a dangerous enemy. The kid that's here is most definitely a runaway. She cropped black hair, tons of black eyeliner, and lots of gothic black clothes. I wonder why she ran away? I don't think she knows anything. She said she hitched a ride here from a truck driver, and I don't think she's lying. Despite her efforts to look tough, she has a soft voice. She wasn't meant to be like this. Her name is Mason. Thank God she's safe, though. Who knows what could have happened with a truck driver? Yes, I know not all of them are pervs, but come on, you've seen the movies. She's staying in the room next to mine. I'm glad because I'll be able to keep an eye on her, but I'm also scared for her. I can't imagine if anything happened to her because of me and what I have awoken. My parental skills are kicking in even though I've never had children. Chip hasn't slept since we got here. He stayed up all night pacing and growling at the door. I didn't get any sleep last night. I have dark shadows under my eyes because I refuse to fall asleep. I'm pretty sure he can smell the decaying flesh of the beast that is hunting us and has killed Eleanor. I can't bear to watch him suffer. I know that he misses Eleanor. I do. My dogs were the only family I had left. Now, it's just Chip and me. My father died when I was a little girl. It was on a hunting trip. They say he must have been attacked by a wild animal because his body was never recovered. I'm starting to think I might be reliving his experience. Right now, Chip and my rifle are my only source of protection. I'm going to look for sources of fire later. The gas station looks new, but the lights haven't been on and I haven't seen anybody in there. There might be gas and supplies that I can use to kill this motherfucker. That is, before it gets me. I just hope I can save myself and this little girl before it's too late. I still have no idea what woke it up. Could it have been already awake? Maybe I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I prayed last night. Why God? Why me? Why would you let a creature this ferocious and demonic be born? Why let it roam the earth? What have I done to deserve this? Why God? Why? As I walked around town, I noticed none of the other buildings had scratches. Even Mason didn't hear any growling or had scratches on her doors. It's eerie. It's like I'm the only one who can see and hear this beast. Or maybe the others are just pretending. I plan on looking into this town's past. They have to have had something to do with this creature. It's impossible that they haven't. I need to rest, but I am too afraid to close my eyes. I am afraid of what will come and slit my throat in my sleep. Of what will devour me, bones and all. I am slowly being driven insane by the utter madness of this situation. I can't take it anymore. I need this to end, and I'm going to be the one to end it. I will try to check in as soon as I can or when I get new information on this hell creature. Thank you for your support. I don't know how much more of this madness I can take. I thought I had it all figured out. Turns out IT's smarter than I think, than anyone thinks or could possibly imagine. What could I possibly have done to wake this beast? I am writing to you in hopes that one day, someone will be able to kill it. I don't know if I can, if I am smart or strong enough. Last night was the worst night so far. It finally fed on human flesh. For the last 2 days, I have been trying to figure out how to kill this bastard. Fire. That's the answer. I had a plan. I had found gasoline, matches, and even an old couple sticks of dynamite. How lucky was I? Turns out back in the 1900s this town was famous for coal mining. There's even a couple of coal mines that weren't closed off. I thought I had it all figured out. So did that son of a bitch. It was nearing dusk yesterday, and I had everything laid out. It wasn't a super fancy trap or anything, but it would do the deed and kill this demon. At dusk, I was ready and waiting for it to come. I knew it would. It always does. My trap was set right in the outskirts of the woods. I wanted to keep the motel owner and the stowaway kid out of this. I found enough dynamite to make 4 small piles. I placed them in ring and connected them all with some spare cord that I found. Hopefully this would work. I sat in the middle of the circle and waited, my trusty rifle at my side. I also had multiple knives on me hidden beneath my shirt and in my boots. Soon I heard growling that seemed to be getting closer and closer. Then it stopped and all was quiet. I don't mean peaceful silence. I mean dead silence. No birds chirping or squirrels running around in the trees. It's like they knew what was coming and were trying to save themselves. Leaves start to crunch and twigs snap. The growling resumes, but it sounds like it's coming from all directions. I stood up and braced myself the best I could. Who can prepare you for the moment you must fight a beast descended from the fires of hell itself? Then it emerged from the woods. I cannot describe how horrifying this creature was. I wanted to close my eyes and curl up in a ball until this whole thing was over with. I almost did. But then I stopped myself and decided that I wouldn't let this beast harm any other people. I wasn't trying to play hero. I was trying to save myself. This creature was entombed in decaying yellow skin. Its glowing yellow eyes stared into mine, and I felt my bones shake. The Wendigo loomed over me. Its sharp fangs were leering at me, almost laughing, as if saying, "Ha ha, what now?" I snapped myself out of my fear-induced stupor and ran to the nearest pile of dynamite. I pulled my pack of matches out and tried to get one lit. My hands were shaking so bad that it took 3 tries. The Wendigo slowly stalked towards me on its towering legs. I dropped the match on the pile and waited for fireworks. No such luck. The match sputtered and died as it landed just to the side of the dynamite wick. My heart dropped. I was certainly doomed. I had it all planned out that I didn't expect anything to go wrong. I looked around for the patch of matches that had fallen out of my hand when the creature battered me aside with a swipe of its paw. Blackness. When I regain consciousness, I see the Wendigo peering over me. There is a long gash along my left leg, put there by its monstrous teeth. I groan and try to sit up. Soon, I find the beast on top of me snarling and spitting in my face. I find one of the hunting knives I had hidden on me and plunge it as far as it'll go before crawling away. I look at the creature and find the hilt sticking from where its stomach should be. Grayish-blue blood is oozing from the wound. The beast roars in pain. "Hey, what's going dash?" That sentence is cut off as the Wendigo lunges for Mason, the runaway kid. With a single swipe of his clawed hand, the creature tears into the kid's chest, chunks of flesh ripping away. The look on Mason's face will haunt me forever. It was pure fear and surprise. The poor kid never saw it coming. I scream in frustration as I try to get the nearest pile of dynamite. I reach it and frantically search the ground for a match and feel a minuscule sense of hope as I find one. I strike it against the nearest rock and toss it onto the pile. I stand up on my legs and groan as I hobble away. The force of the explosion pushes me to the ground. Despite the dull ringing in my ears, I can hear a blood-curdling shriek. I look into the flames and see the dancing figure of the hell creature. Red and orange engulf its body as it is burned. I lay down among the ferns and brush that coat the forest floor. I closed my eyes and drifted off. You must be thinking by now that I killed it, that the Wendigo is dead. When I come to, I get up and make my way to the burned patch of land. I look around for any sign of a corpse, but find none. Not even bones. I could have been naive and assumed that the ashes scattered on the ground were from the beast, but I knew better. It probably ran off back to where it came from to nurse its injuries. I know that there is a good possibility that it'll come back. Of course, I'll be long before that does happen. I have since made it back home. I am never going back to that cabin. Let it sit there and rot. A reminder of the constant sorrow that can lie in these woods among the beauty. Let it remind people of nature's dark side. I am thinking of having a memorial for Mason and Eleanor. Chip is okay. I had left him in the motel room before I embarked on the hunt. I couldn't lose him. He's the only family I have left. I am okay. I will be. At least until it comes again. This time, I will be ready. 5th story. I used to be a park ranger in the Adirondacks. I think we're all in trouble. It was close to 3 in the afternoon when the knock came on the door to the ranger station. I was mildly surprised to hear it, given that it was early January in the foothills of the Adirondacks and the temperature was hovering at a balmy 12 degrees, with wind chills driving it into the negatives with frustrating frequency. The wind had been howling against the isolated station since before sunrise that morning, and I wondered if I was going to need to deal with any damage to my little abode after the storm blew through. I'd been monitoring the forecast and weather radar all day, and it looked like I was in for quite the blizzard by the time evening rolled around. It had been snowing most of the day already, but so far it hadn't been very heavy. I expected that to change by nightfall, however, which, in January, was only in another couple hours. I didn't usually keep the front door to the ranger station locked, since it wasn't uncommon for hikers and campers to make a pit stop on their way up the trail to the observation areas, either to log their camping site for the night or just in hopes of a nice hot cup of coffee before they continued on their hike. The door hadn't been latching correctly lately, though, and had the tendency to swing open when a strong gust caught it just right, so I'd been keeping it locked until I could repair it. The knocking was light, somehow hesitant and almost polite, if that makes any sense. It was so quiet that I almost didn't hear it over the whistling of the wind and creaking of the station. I'd been in the middle of composing an email request for a new generator, as mine had been acting up a bit lately, and had to pause my typing and listen intently to ensure I'd even heard it in the first place. When it came again, only a bit louder, I pushed back from my desk and took another sip from my steaming mug before walking over and opening the door. Outside stood 5 people, 3 men and 2 women, all dressed in what looked like expensive and very new cold weather coats and snow pants, all looking very similar except for the various bright colors and all bearing the familiar North Face logo. Their anxious faces peeked out from within their drawn and cinched hoods, and I had to suppress a grin. They looked dressed to climb Everest, not hike the lower trails of the Adirondacks. Tourists, probably European and probably their first time seeing this sort of weather, I thought. It was a fairly common occurrence. Folks from all over the world came to visit these mountains, looking to experience all the beautiful wilderness we had to offer. I wasn't unsympathetic. If you weren't used to the unpredictable climate here in the winter, it could quickly catch you by surprise and get dangerous very quickly. "Hi there," I said cheerfully, stepping back into the doorway and motioning them inside. Coming out of the snow and warm up by the fire, the man who'd been knocking turned to his companions, said something in Spanish, and then turned back to me with a wide grin and nodded, stepping past me and into the warmth of the station. The rest followed quickly, anxious to get out of the chill wind that was blowing hard outside. As soon as they were all in, I closed the door again and locked it to make sure it didn't blow open. "Gracias, sir." "I am Martin," said the man, pulling back his hood and unzipping his quilted-down coat. He gestured to the others in turn. "This is Lucas, Diego, Sofia, and Triana." I nodded my greeting to each. Martin continued with a smile. "It is very cold. We come to visit USA from Spain, to see your beautiful mountains and enjoy the lovely scenery." His accent was very heavy, but his English was far better than my Spanish, so I didn't have much room to criticize. "But it seems a storm is coming, and we fear there will be too much snow. Unfortunately, we are not so prepared for that." I nodded, patting him on the shoulder as I moved past him and opened the door leading to the shelter room, reaching in and turning on the lights. "That's certainly true, my friend. I'm afraid we're in for a bit of a blizzard this evening. Bad time for a winter stroll through the mountains," I said. "Fortunately, we happen to have enough space for you and your friends to make yourself at home and wait out the storm. My name is Jackson Turner, Ranger. There's coffee over there on the table and bunks and a comfortable sitting area in here." When the group just stared at me blankly for a moment, I got the feeling I'd lost most of them somewhere along the way. Instead, I just offered the friendliest smile I had and gestured to the room. At that, they all grinned and nodded their thanks as they quickly shuffled past me, dropping their packs on various bunks and beginning to remove their cold weather gear. I made sure they all got something hot to drink and that they understood they were welcome to stay until the weather had cleared before returning to my desk. They all seemed very pleasant and grateful for my assistance, and they drifted from my thoughts as I continued my administrative work. It was another hour before the second knocking rapped at the door, this one slow and oddly arrhythmic, almost a staccato beat, somehow unsteady and not as tentative as my other guests had been. I sighed heavily and straightened, heading around the counter and back over to the door. I hadn't had any visitors to the ranger station in a week or more, and now they were pouring in like this was a holiday in Express or something. I unlocked the door and pulled it open, putting on my official greeting smile once again. In the doorway, shoulders and hooded head covered in a layer of icy snow, was a man of roughly my height, about 6 foot or so. Unlike the others, he wasn't dressed in fancy, color-coordinated cold weather gear, but instead wore a mismatched combination of clothes, like he had raided the bargain bin at a second-hand expedition store. His pants were a blue quilted nylon and looked more on the expensive side, even if they didn't exactly fit him very well, but his coat was fur-lined and looked like it was made of padded wool, layered over an old fleece jacket. His boots looked newer and not too warm, Something more suited to a summer hike than a winter in the mountains, I thought. "Hey there," I said as warmly as I could, waving him inside. "Come on and out of the snow." He didn't say anything, but gave the slightest hint of a nod as he walked past me. The strong scent of musky body odor followed him, and I wondered if he was one of those reclusive hermits that I'd heard rumors of, living out here all by himself in some makeshift shack. I closed the door and locked it again, turning back to the man. He'd already taken note of the bunk room to the left, where the Spaniards were getting settled, and he headed on in and sat on one of the empty bunks in the back corner of the room. He didn't remove his coat or offer any greeting to the others, and I noted with some curiosity that he didn't have any sort of pack with him, which further made me wonder if he lived nearby in some off-grid cabin. I could see that the others were smiling and making pleasantries towards him, but he just sat there, dark eyes quietly watching the activity without a single word. There was the slightest hint of a smile upon his lips, incongruous and somehow unnerving. It only took them a few moments to abandon their attempts at including him in conversation and turn back to their own group, speaking quietly in Spanish amongst themselves. For a moment, I wondered if he might be in some sort of shock. The temperature was dropping pretty quickly outside, and it had already been too cold for some of the clothing he wore. I considered giving him a quick once-over to make sure he didn't have any frostbite or signs of hypothermia, but something about him told me he might not be so welcoming to my attention. I stood there in the doorway to the bunk room for a minute, looking over the scene. Something about the newcomer seemed off somehow. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the way he moved, his lack of communication, the way he was just sitting there perfectly still on the corner bunk, just seemed strange. There was something else, too. Something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Something that tickled the back of my consciousness, just out of reach, more an instinctive unease than coherent thought. I found myself hoping the man would spend a few minutes warming himself and then be on his way again. Turning my attention to the others, I realized that they must have found something odd with him as well, as they had all subconsciously clustered around the end of the table farthest from him and were speaking more quietly than before, more subdued. I noticed them periodically casting quick, uncomfortable glances in his direction, but never for more than the briefest of moments, as if they were just reassuring themselves that he hadn't moved and was still sitting there. I also noticed curiously that none of them sat with their back to the man, likely also subconsciously. I was just about to walk over and talk to him, to shake the odd feeling away, when Martin appeared in front of me, his brow furrowed. "Sir, my friends and I are worried about the other campers," he said. This drew my attention. There weren't any campers registered to be out here today. Was the newcomer one of them? Maybe they were in trouble. "What campers?" I asked with a frown. He motioned vaguely to the north. We passed their campsite on our way to the observation point, before the weather turned us back here. Maybe a half-kilometer up the trail, in a clearing beside a small brook. He cast a quick look over his shoulder at the stranger sitting in the corner. There it was again, I thought, that same unease. Martin continued. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman. They had some of those cold weather tents set up and seemed to be well prepared for the storm, at least as far as we could tell. We stopped and warmed ourselves by their fire for a bit. They seemed very experienced and were not concerned about the cold, but I am no expert. "Well, it sounds like they should be okay," I said with the best reassuring smile I could muster. "They should have checked in with me, but if they're as prepared as you think, I'm sure they'll be just fine. When the storm passes, I'll head up there and check on them, just to make sure." He flicked his eyes to the man again, and then locked them with mine with a surprising intensity, like he was trying to tell me something with his gaze alone. He lowered his voice and said, "The campers, they were all wearing very good clothing. Sophia's brother is a climber in some very cold regions, and she recognized the camper's gear as similar to what he uses." "Even better news, then," I started, but Martin cut me off. "Exactly like the pants that man is wearing now," he said quietly. I looked over at the man again, once again taking note of his hodgepodge combination of clothing. The gloves he still wore looked to be thin and ill-suited to the winter weather, but looked well-made and would have been fine for a mild autumn outing. He still hadn't moved or said anything, and his emotionless eyes drifted slowly across the Spaniards with what seemed to my growing paranoia like a hungry interest. It was almost like he was inventorying them, evaluating them, somehow. Once again, that tickle in the back of my brain, telling me something was not quite right with the man. Something was just a little out of place, but I still couldn't figure it out. It set my teeth on edge. I looked back at Martin. "Are you sure?" He shrugged. "As sure as we can be. Sophia says she is certain, but the rest of us do not have the experience to recognize these details as well as her." "Was this man with them?" I asked, but I already knew the answer. Martin shook his head. "No, I have never seen him before now." He leaned in a little closer and lowered his voice. "This man, there is something," he said, trailing off, unable to find the right words. I nodded. "I know. I feel it, too." I walked back to my desk and opened a drawer, retrieving the holstered handgun and attaching it to my belt. The spare magazine went into my pocket, and I grabbed my heavy jacket from a nearby hook and pulled my fur-lined hat over my ears. Martin followed me, watching with interest. I looked over his shoulder, making sure we were out of sight and earshot of the bunk room. "I'm going to check on the camp. Have you ever handled a shotgun?" I asked. He nodded. "I hunt pheasant with my cousins every year. I am a very good shot." "Good," I said. "That doorway beside my desk is my room. Right inside you'll find a 12-gauge pump, loaded but not chambered, if you need it." He just gave a silent duck of his head. "I should be back within the hour. I know the place you're talking about. Keep him here until I return, but don't do anything if you don't have to," I said, closing my coat and making sure the zippered slit covering my holster was open and accessible. "Be careful, Jackson Turner. I feel some darkness in the air." I just gave a tight-lipped nod before opening the door and stepping out into the wind. The icy chill hit me immediately, cutting through my heavy pants and finding its way through every little opening in my clothing. The wind out here was a constant buffeting and howled in my ears. The snow along the trail was only a little over ankle deep, but tugged at my boots with every step, slowing my progress. The area that Martin had described was one of the few marked campsites along this area of the trail, and though it wasn't strictly required for campers to check in before setting up, it was highly encouraged. This deep in the woods, 20 miles away from the nearest town, the only real lifeline that anyone had were the rangers. If anything went wrong out here, the fact that you registered with the local ranger station may very well mean the difference between life and death. That didn't mean that everyone followed that rule, though. Most of the time, it was new campers, those folks lacking some of the wisdom of experience, that didn't know or didn't think it necessary to check in before setting camp. Sometimes, it was the opposite. Some highly experienced outdoors folks felt that there was no need, that they could handle anything that came their way. Either way, as I followed that northern trail, a growing unease began to color my steps. I felt the tight grip of anxiousness tickling my every breath. I didn't know what I was going to find. If I was lucky, I'd find 3 cold weather, double-wall, silicone nylon tents, with their occupants snuggled warmly and safely within. If that was the case, I'd just check on them and turn back to my station, hopefully before the worst of the storm began in earnest. If not, well, I'd have to figure that out when it came. Asterisk. A half-hour later, I reached the campsite. Or, at least, what was left of it. The remains of what were obviously 3 high-quality winter tents were positioned compactly around a central fire pit, their bright red material shredded and torn and flapping violently in the fierce wind, looking very much like a lunatic array of flags in the heart of a hurricane. I pulled the ears of my hat lower, adjusting the chin strap tighter. "Hello," I shouted, straining to make my voice carry above the wind. Even with all my force, it still sounded pathetically impotent in the roar of the coming storm. "Is anyone here?" I waited a long moment, but could hear nothing but the rush of wind and the whip-like snapping of the nylon fabric. The campsite had all the hallmarks of a bear attack, except I hadn't seen a bear in months, and we'd never had a bear attack in this area that I'd ever heard of. It wasn't like the forests out west. We didn't have brown bears here. Black bears, yeah, but they were smaller and nowhere near as aggressive as big browns. Sure, they could be dangerous, especially if startled or threatened, but they didn't actively hunt humans. I took a few more steps forward into the campsite, drawing the Sig Sauer 10mm and holding it at low ready as I performed a quick visual of the tents. Nothing. No signs of bodies, blood, a struggle, anything at all. Just destroyed tents that could have been abandoned by the campers when the wind started getting bad and the fabric started to fail. And then it caught my eye. A flash of dark gray, partially hidden by the snow between two of the tents. Another 10 minutes of snowfall and I'd have never seen it. Moving closer, I towed the frozen bundle of cloth, overturning it before picking it up with my free hand, keeping the Sig at the ready. It was a pair of thick winter pants, old and torn and covered in dark red-brown stains that looked too fresh for my comfort. They were fur-lined and looked to be woolen. As soon as I lifted them free of the snow, the wind blew a familiar musky smell into my face, and I dropped them in revulsion. Another 2 feet beyond, the hint of blue in the white drift drew my attention, and I cautiously approached. I recognized the puffy material of a cold-weather jacket, and when I reached out to expose more of it, I staggered backwards in shock, realizing suddenly that I was looking at a crudely dismembered arm still wrapped snugly in its warm jacket sleeve. I cursed aloud and stumbled backwards, tripping over the stones surrounding the fire pit and falling hard on my ass, eyes wide and not even registering the pain of my tailbone meeting the frozen ground. I sat there, hyperventilating for what felt like minutes, long enough that the frigid chill was settling into my legs and backside from where I sat dumbly in the snow, eyes wide and breath ragged. It was only when my arms began to shake that I realized I was gripping the handgun as tightly as I could, aimed insanely at the gray mass of frozen trousers on the ground before me as if they were going to suddenly spring to life and attack. Shit, was all I could think to say as rationality suddenly returned, clearing the pulsating red spots from my vision and slamming my thoughts back to the present jarringly. The pounding in my ears began to lessen, replaced once again with the unrelenting wail of the wind. I leapt to my feet and started running back along the trail, back to my station, where Martin and Lucas and Diego and Sophia and the other girl, whose name I couldn't remember, sheltered from the coming storm with. With what? Was he some sort of psycho serial killer, stalking the lonely hiking trails of upstate New York? That didn't make any sense. I'd been here for 3 years and never heard of anything like this. As I ran clumsily through the snow, which was now halfway up my shin, I thought back to those gray pants, discarded in the campsite. They had been shredded, not just torn and ripped from age and wear. It had been something violent that caused the damage, and the bloodstains seemed to lend credence to that theory. So whatever had happened, the stranger had decided to replace his damaged and stained pants with what? Those of his victims? And then I thought about how none of his clothes matched, and how his boots and gloves weren't even suitable for winter weather. How long had this been going on? 20 minutes later, the dim yellow lights from the windows of my station appeared suddenly from the nearly white-out conditions that had overtaken me with the full coming of the storm. The temperature had dropped even more, and I was amazed that I had been able to keep up my pace long enough to make it back, driven by adrenaline and fear. I slowed to a halt before my ranger station, noticing immediately how the front door hung open a few inches. My mind urged me forward to go racing in, but I had to take a few moments to catch my breath and let my racing heart slow a bit before I entered. I couldn't understand why the door was only open a few finger widths. If it hadn't been locked, the first strong gust of wind would have blown it fully open and sent it banging against the wood paneling of the wall behind it. But what occupied my thoughts far more was the implication of that open door. There's no way it could have been missed by anyone within, and nobody in their right mind would have sat in the station while the freezing wind and snow blew in through the open doorway. I pushed the throw aside and crept as quietly as possible to the door, pushing it gently at first, then with greater force as I felt some resistance holding it closed. I gripped my sidearm tightly, muzzle directly forward and at chest level, finger resting along the frame of the pistol and ready to drop to the trigger and go to work in a moment's notice. The door gradually gave way and pushed inward far enough that I was able to slide through the gap, the howling of the wind and the protesting of the building blessedly providing enough cacophony to cover the sounds of my entrance. As soon as I stepped inside, I found myself in the center of a fever nightmare. A body lay behind the door and had served as an impromptu barricade. I could only tell that it was one of the women by the delicate shape of the body, as the head and upper torso had been savagely mutilated, the skin and scalp torn away from the red white of the skull viciously. Presumably while she had desperately tried to make her escape from whatever hell had pursued her. Blood slicked nearly every surface around me, hot and stinking of copper, and I became aware of a wet, tearing sound emanating from the bunk room. The lights in that room were flickering chaotically, the hanging bulb in the center of the room swinging maniacally, as if it had been recently struck and was still settling its pendulum motion. As quietly as I could, I ducked around the doorway into the room, fresh shock coursing through my body in a cold wash that threatened my consciousness. Bodies and pieces of bodies lay strewn about the room haphazardly, most still enshrouded in bits of clothing, now tacked in place by sticky crimson. I could feel the heat in the room from whatever horrifying act of violence had occurred, from the bodies that now lay scattered about like discarded playthings. At my feet, I noted a handful of empty shotgun shells, where they had fallen and been arrested by the viscous gore that painted the wooden floorboards. The shotgun lay nearby, chamber opened and magazine tube empty, only inches away from the barely recognizable remains of the man I'd known as Martin. Terrible slashes and wounds covered his ravaged corpse, looking as if he'd been thrown into a shredder. His limbs were outstretched and only attached by the yellowish tendons and pink muscles which now lay open and exposed. My eyes were drawn at that moment to the source of the sounds I'd heard before, and I saw the crouched form of the stranger straddling one of the bodies, Lucas, I think, by the bright yellow of his North Face jacket. I watched in horror as the stranger dipped his head again and again, jerking it savagely each time it came away, as if tearing away more bits of meat with each movement. I noticed then that the stranger's hands had somehow grown, elongated, and taken on a shiny chitinous appearance that left the fingers as jagged and gore-encrusted claws. After only a moment's shocked hesitation, my reflexes took over and I snapped the muzzle of my handgun up and squeezed the trigger. I know that the thunderous blast of the 10mm must have been deafening, but I barely registered it as I watched blackened holes appear in the thing's back. It threw its head back in what I can only hope was pain and cried out in a shrieking screech that drowned out all else. I squeezed the trigger again, and another bullet punched its way through the horrifying thing. Suddenly, almost faster than I could track, the stranger exploded up from where it had been feasting and lit upon the wall, its terrible claws sinking into the wood and holding it in place as it turned its head 180 degrees to face me. The eyes had turned completely black and grown to the size of golf balls, and the jaw looked almost to have disjointed from its skull, the skin at the corners of its mouth drawn back in a hideous grin that stretched nearly from ear to ear, exposing a mouthful of shark-like triangular teeth, now stained bright red. It tensed, and an instant later it had leapt to the next wall, gripping the exposed wood like some monstrous insect, eyes fixed upon me. Before it could make another move, I fired again and again and again, my panic-induced attack miraculously finding purchase more often than not as empty brass cases ejected against the doorframe next to me, ringing out like death bells. Then there was a long moment of silent stillness in the room, and its black eyes were fixed on me, still unnervingly cold and alien. I tensed, waiting for the thing to pounce towards me, but it was clear I'd heard it. I don't know how badly, but black ichor dripped from the half-dozen wounds punched by my hollow points, and I thought I heard a sickly rattling in its slow, deep breaths. With a final ear-splitting, otherworldly shriek, it leapt again, this time away from me and through the window at the rear of the room. The glass shattered outward, and then it was over. I stood alone in this charnel house, left only with the remains of the 5 Spanish tourists and the disconcerting awareness that the slide of my handgun was locked back, smoke lazily drifting from the barrel and the magazine now empty. Asterisk. That was almost a year ago, and I've since transferred from field operations to an administrative position within the Park Service. My office is located in the middle of a city, surrounded by people and without a lonely forest or dark wilderness in sight. After the investigation died down and the deaths were ruled as animal predation, I tried to return to my posting, but I just couldn't do it. They tore down the old station and built a new one closer to the trailhead, and I thought I could get past it, but I kept seeing that stranger, that creature, every time I closed my eyes. A few times in the dark stillness of the night, I thought I could hear that banshee wail echoing in the distance. Once or twice, I think I heard more than one. I slept with my handgun on the nightstand and the shotgun propped next to my bed, and kept the doors locked at all times. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, maybe searching for me. Maybe it needed to make sure that I wasn't able to tell anyone about it. You see, in the time since that horrible night, I've scoured the internet for any possible explanation for what I saw. I consulted any self-proclaimed cryptozoologist or paranormal investigator that would speak to me, but nobody had any rational explanations beyond fairy tales and urban legends. And invariably, I was left with as many questions as I started with. And then I tripped across an article one day that changed everything for me. It was a piece written about something called the Uncanny Valley, an idea put forth by some Japanese roboticists back in the 70s. At first, I almost passed it over, since it seemed mostly to relate to robots and computer graphics and how people feel increasingly uncomfortable the more realistically human they appear. But then I read a theory about why people may react this way and how it may be an evolutionary artifact left over in the dark corners of our reptilian brains. About how, at some point in our distant shared racial history, there may have actually been predators that looked almost human. They may have appeared so close to our ancestors that they were able to blend in with us almost perfectly. According to the theory, primitive humans may have developed a keen sense of facial recognition as a survival mechanism. This may have been passed down through genetic memories, fading just a little with each generation until today, where it existed as little more than an instinctive warning when we looked at someone who wasn't quite right. Someone who seemed almost normal, but perhaps with the slightest of imperfections that made them seem just a little wrong. Someone that our instincts told us didn't belong. Someone who wasn't really one of us at all. I wondered if these things have been with us all along, hiding among us, stalking us from within our own numbers. Yesterday, on my commute to the office, I noticed a young woman sitting by herself in the back of the subway car. Even though it was crowded, the seats beside her were empty, and I noticed that the other commuters almost seemed to be avoiding getting too close to her. I don't think anyone really realized it, but people kept glancing uneasily at her out of the corners of their eyes. There was nothing overtly out of place with her, and it could have just been happenstance that nobody had elected to sit down next to her. I just couldn't shake the feeling, though, that something just felt off. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.